Today I want to talk about overseas aid. The issue has really come into focus in the last year or two because Malawi has historically received quite a lot of overseas aid coming from UK, coming from the EU, coming from America. But over the last few years, that situation has started to change very noticeably. First of all, we had what was called Cashgate. Cashgate was the revelation, shocking and surprising as it was, that a lot of money was getting stolen corruptly in Malawi. Now, of course, that was not a surprise and was not a shock to anyone. What happened was things that were widely known about were leaked to the media. The media splashed them, and there was a very high profile witch hunt in a sense. Although very few people got caught up in it, a few people were arrested. There was much browbeating among the media classes and so on about the awful state of affairs in Malawi, conveniently forgetting perhaps that it had always been like that, and that it was just that suddenly it had come out. Now, there are various reasons put forward as to why Cashgate came out when it did. One of those suggestions is that it was done to damage the Joyce Banda government, which had just come into power after the death of the president. She took over because she was the vice president. Many people didn't want her. Some people suggest that the Cashgate thing was leaked at that point in order to put the blame onto her government, even though most of the people involved, of course, were not in her government. They were in the previous one. There are other suggestions, but for whatever reason, Cashgate did come out. It caused a lot of soul-searching here in Malawi, but it also caused European governments to decide to suspend foreign aid, and for some years they did that. The EU came in and did audits and did training and made a list of suggestions. They said, if you want us to continue with direct grants, you will have to do this, this and this. They gave a number of financial measures that they wanted to be put in place. They said financial controls were way too lax, and as a result, eventually some aid came back in. What happened was that the governments in Europe particularly decided to focus their aid to organisations directly rather than through the government, and it changed the focus of the way that aid came into the country. But there was still a lot of aid coming in, a lot of NGOs, all the big ones that you will have heard of, like Oxfam and WaterAid and World Vision and those sorts of organisations, were all working here with large numbers of people on the ground, lots of cars, a big network of people mainly in Lilongwe, people coming in for conferences, staying in expensive hotels and all that kind of thing, which many of us are aware of and are rather concerned about. But those organisations continued mostly until recently. Then, of course, under Trump 2.0, the American aid program has been pretty much removed entirely, and the British government announced just recently that they were going to cut direct aid to Malawi by 90%. over the next few years in order to fund more weapons. Now, I found that so extraordinary that I actually had to go and look it up and double check that they really did say that, because it's almost impossible to believe that they quite openly and without any seeming embarrassment said that they were going to cut 90% of the aid that they give to, I think, the poorest Commonwealth country in the world, because they need to buy more weapons for the UK not to use. But that's what they said, and that is what is going to happen. So far, the aid network in Malawi has been badly hit. There are huge amounts of cuts. There's huge amount of damage as a result of the Americans going, because although some of the money was not properly scrutinized and was not carefully monitored, a lot of it did get to its intended destination, and a lot of it did what it was supposed to be doing. Programs like medicine, AIDS, ARVs, other medicines, condoms, programs to provide nutrition for kids, those kind of programs were a very large part of what USAID was doing here, and it's all gone. I was surprised to find just how widely they were donating. One of our Chimbote students currently is at university, and he called me recently to say, I'm going to need school fees for the last term of my degree. And in the past, that last semester was funded by USAID. He's doing a social work degree, and USAID partly funded it, and they fully funded the fees for the last semester, so the students didn't have to pay anything for that one. USAID have gone. So suddenly it affects even very unexpected areas, like a university student doing a social work degree. Now, he's lucky because Chimbote support him, and we're able to pay that money. Otherwise, he would not be able to finish his degree because he doesn't have 650,000 kwacha. So the effect of these cuts is very wide-reaching, and although I personally have some quite serious reservations about some of the aid organisations and some of the charities and the way that they run things, overall, a lot of the money reaches the places that it was meant to go, and it's going to do enormous damage. People will die as a result of these cuts. There is no doubt about that. Already, most people in Malawi rely on aid of one sort or another. Most people get, if they're poor, most people get aid from somebody in the family at some point, but they also then will rely on aid that comes in the form of food relief, coupons to help them to buy fertilizer when they plant their crops, all sorts of things which our people rely on are part of this aid machine, which works really night and day to try and alleviate the worst possible outcomes for millions of people. As I've said already, most people in Malawi are very, very poor, living in the village on a subsistence farming system where they are always on the edge, always close to going under. And these cuts in aid are going to be a disaster.